Have you ever wondered why the same moment of physical closeness can feel completely different with different men? Even when everything on the surface looks the same, why does one man feel distant, almost emotionally absent, while another feels deeply present, even without saying a single word? There is a truth most people never really stop to think about. Not all men experience intimacy in the same way. And more importantly, not all men reveal love in obvious ways. Some men are easy to read. They express emotions directly, they communicate openly, and their feelings are clear. But there is another type of man that is far more complex, the kind who carries emotions that are deep, but hidden beneath layers of silence, control, and emotional protection. And if you have ever felt confused by someone like this, it is not because the feelings are not real. It is because you are looking for love in the wrong places, the loud places. When in reality, the strongest emotions often live in silence. This is where psychology becomes important, especially a pattern known as avoidant attachment. Men with avoidant tendencies are not emotionless. In fact, they often feel deeply. But early in life, many of them learned something painful without even realizing it. They learned that being open can lead to disappointment, rejection, or emotional discomfort. So instead of expressing what they feel, they learn to control it, to suppress it, to hide it behind distance and self-control. On the outside, this can make them look detached, calm, even unaffected. But on the inside, there is often a constant battle between connection and protection. They want closeness, but they also fear what closeness might cost them. And this internal conflict becomes especially visible during moments of emotional or physical intimacy, because intimacy is where defenses naturally weaken. It is in these moments that the mask starts to crack, not dramatically, but subtly, not through words, but through behavior. And most people completely miss it because they are expecting obvious signs. But real emotional truth rarely announces itself loudly. It reveals itself quietly, through shifts in attention, energy, and presence. And this is where things start to become deeply interesting. When a man with emotional distance begins to experience genuine love, something inside him starts to change. Not instantly, not dramatically, but gradually in ways that are easy to overlook unless you know what to look for. The emotional walls that once felt permanent begin to soften, even if only for a moment. And in those moments, his true emotional state begins to surface. But here is the part most people never understand. These changes are not about physical action. They are about emotional alignment. They are about whether a man is simply experiencing a moment or truly feeling connected within it. And the difference between those two states is everything, because when love is not real, a man remains mentally elsewhere. His attention is divided, his presence is partial, his emotional engagement is limited to the surface level. But when something deeper exists, when genuine emotional attachment is present, his entire internal state begins to shift toward connection instead of control. This is not something he consciously decides. It happens naturally, almost instinctively. The emotional defenses that normally keep distance in place begin to weaken, and for a brief window of time, he stops overthinking. He stops protecting, and he starts experiencing. And this is where the truth begins to show itself, not in grand declarations, not in dramatic expressions, but in small, almost invisible changes in how he shows up emotionally in that moment, the way attention becomes steadier, the way emotional resistance lowers, the way presence becomes more grounded, even if nothing is being said. Most people miss this entirely because they are focused on what is visible. But emotional reality is rarely visible in the way people expect. It lives beneath behavior. It lives in energy. It lives in presence. And if you are paying attention closely, you begin to realize something powerful. Love is not always expressed through words or obvious gestures. Sometimes it is revealed in the absence of distance, in the quiet disappearance of emotional walls, in the rare moments where a man who normally holds everything back allows himself to simply be there, fully, without escape. Now, before going deeper into what these subtle signs actually are, there is something important to understand about how deeply psychology shapes emotional behavior in men like this. Because once you understand that, you will never look at emotional connection the same way again. And if you stay until the end, you will begin to see a pattern that most people completely overlook. a pattern that separates temporary desire from genuine emotional attachment in ways that are far more powerful than words could ever explain. There is a reason men often feel like a mystery, even to people who have known them for years. It is not because they feel less. It is because their emotions are processed in a different internal language that is rarely spoken out loud. From early life, many men are taught something very subtle but powerful. They are encouraged to be strong, to stay composed, to not show too much emotional reaction. Over time, this does not remove emotion. It only changes where it goes. Feelings that are not expressed do not disappear. They get redirected inward. They become private experiences instead of shared expressions. And this is where the emotional mystery begins. What most people see on the outside is only the final layer of a much deeper internal process. A man can appear calm while his inner world is active. He can stay silent while thinking deeply. He can look unchanged while actually feeling a strong emotional shift inside. But because nothing is expressed clearly, others assume nothing is happening at all. This misunderstanding creates distance between perception and reality. The emotional world of many men is not built around expression first. It is built around processing first, meaning before anything is shown, it is analyzed internally, filtered, controlled, sometimes even delayed. This creates a gap between what is felt and what is visible, and that gap is where confusion grows for others. In psychology, this can be connected to emotional restriction patterns that develop over time, not because emotions are weak, but because emotional expression was never made safe or encouraged in the same way. So instead of learning to release feelings outwardly, many learn to hold them internally until they settle. But holding emotions does not reduce their strength. It increases their depth. When feelings stay inside for longer periods, they do not remain at the surface level. They sink deeper into identity. They become part of how a person reacts, decides, and connects. This is why some men may not speak about what they feel, but their behavior still reflects emotional influence in subtle ways. The mystery comes from this mismatch. People expect emotion to look a certain way, but in many men, emotion does not follow visible patterns. It follows internal logic. And internal logic is not always easy to read from the outside. Another important layer is emotional vocabulary. Not all individuals are trained to identify and name what they feel in real time. Some can feel tension, comfort, fear, or attachment, but cannot immediately translate those sensations into clear emotional language. So instead of expressing "I feel vulnerable" or "I feel deeply connected," the emotion stays unspoken and is expressed indirectly through behavior, timing, or silence. This creates situations where emotional truth exists, but clarity does not. And when clarity is missing, interpretation takes over. People begin to fill the gaps with assumptions. If something is not said, it is assumed to not exist. If something is not shown clearly, it is assumed to be absent. But human emotion does not always work in direct signals, especially in individuals who rely heavily on internal regulation. There is also a deeper psychological factor involved: emotional protection through control. When someone learns that strong emotional exposure can lead to discomfort or loss of control, they naturally begin to regulate how much of themselves they reveal. This regulation becomes automatic over time. It is not a decision made in each moment. It becomes a default response system. So even in moments where emotion is strong, expression may remain limited. This is where the mystery becomes most noticeable. Because from the outside, it can look like distance, but internally, it may be intensity. A calm face does not always mean a calm mind. A quiet presence does not always mean an empty emotional state. Often, it is the opposite. Silence can carry more emotional activity than speech. There is also something important about how men often process connection. Instead of external validation, many rely on internal alignment. They evaluate feelings based on consistency rather than expression. If something feels stable inside, it is considered real, even if it is not openly communicated. This creates another layer of invisibility for others trying to understand what is happening emotionally. And this is where most misunderstandings are born. People tend to look for emotional truth in visible signals, words, gestures, reactions. But in many men, emotional truth is stored in consistency of behavior, subtle shifts in attention, and internal reflection. It is less about what is said in the moment and more about what changes quietly over time. Another key aspect is emotional compartmentalization. This is when different feelings are kept in separate mental spaces. Daily life, responsibility, and emotional experience do not always blend together. They can exist in parallel. So a man may be fully functional in one area while emotionally processing something entirely different in another without external signs of conflict. To an outside observer, this can feel confusing, but internally, it is a form of stability, a way to keep functioning while still feeling deeply. All of this builds the foundation of emotional mystery, not because emotions are missing, but because they are structured differently, less direct, more internal, less expressive, more contained. And when emotional containment is strong, only specific moments allow cracks in that structure. Moments where control softens, moments where internal resistance lowers, moments where what is usually hidden begins to surface in subtle behavior. Understanding this changes the way emotional connection is interpreted. It shifts focus away from loud expression and toward quiet consistency. It teaches that what is not spoken can still be deeply present, and what appears simple on the surface may actually carry a much heavier emotional reality underneath. As this becomes clearer, the next layer reveals something even more important. Because once emotional mystery is understood, the real signs of genuine attachment begin to stand out in ways that cannot be ignored. Avoidant psychology does not mean a person is incapable of love. It means love is experienced through layers of caution. For many men with this pattern, emotional closeness feels like both comfort and risk at the same time. This creates an internal conflict that shapes how they behave, especially in deeply personal moments. At the core of this pattern is a learned response system. When emotional exposure in the past was met with misunderstanding, rejection, or loss of control, the mind builds a protective structure. That structure does not remove the need for connection. It only changes how connection is approached. Instead of moving directly toward closeness, the mind tests it, slows it down, and evaluates safety before fully engaging. This is why emotional openness in such individuals rarely happens all at once. It unfolds in stages. The first stage is observation. The second is hesitation. The third is controlled engagement. And only under certain conditions does the final stage appear, where emotional defenses relax enough for genuine vulnerability to surface. What makes this complex is that the outer behavior may not change drastically between stages. The real shift happens internally. It is felt rather than shown, and because it is internal, it often goes unnoticed by others who are expecting more obvious signs. Another important element is trust calibration. Instead of trusting quickly, emotional safety is measured in small increments. Consistency matters more than intensity. A stable emotional environment slowly reduces internal alertness. When that alertness lowers, the nervous system stops preparing for emotional withdrawal. Only then does deeper presence become possible. This is why timing plays such an important role in emotional expression for avoidant individuals. The same situation can produce completely different behavior depending on how safe the internal state feels in that moment. If the mind perceives pressure or emotional demand, it increases distance. If it perceives calmness and acceptance, it reduces resistance. There is also a strong link between emotional regulation and control. Many men with avoidant patterns rely heavily on self-control as a form of emotional stability. Control is not just a habit, it becomes a safety mechanism. It creates predictability in situations that might otherwise feel overwhelming. But when genuine emotional connection begins to form, that control starts to loosen in subtle ways. This loosening does not appear as chaos. It appears as softness in behavior, a reduction in emotional tension, a slight shift in responsiveness. The individual may not consciously recognize it happening, but the nervous system begins to relax its protective stance when it senses consistent emotional safety. One of the most overlooked aspects is internal permission. For emotional vulnerability to appear, there must be an internal signal that it is acceptable to lower defenses. Without that permission, even strong feelings remain contained. This is why external circumstances alone are not enough to create emotional openness. The internal state must align with them. Over time, repeated safe interactions begin to reshape emotional expectations. The mind starts to learn that closeness does not always lead to loss of control. This learning process is slow because it is built on emotional memory rather than logic. Each calm experience adds a small layer of reassurance, gradually weakening the need for distance. However, this does not eliminate caution completely. Instead, it creates moments where caution is temporarily suspended. These moments are rare and subtle, but they carry significant emotional weight. They are not dramatic shifts. They are quiet reductions in resistance. In such moments, attention becomes more stable. Emotional response becomes less filtered. The need to analyze every feeling decreases slightly, allowing presence to feel more natural. This is often where deeper connection becomes noticeable, even if nothing is verbally expressed. Another factor is emotional synchronization. When internal emotional rhythm begins to align with another person's presence, the sense of separation reduces. This alignment is not conscious. It happens gradually through repeated exposure to emotional steadiness. Once synchronization starts, emotional distance feels less necessary as a protective tool. It is also important to understand that withdrawal patterns in avoidant individuals are not always signs of disinterest. They are often signs of emotional overload. When feelings become too strong or too unfamiliar, the mind temporarily increases distance to regain balance. This cycle of approach and withdrawal can be confusing, but it is part of the regulation process. What breaks this cycle is not pressure, but emotional consistency. A steady environment allows the internal system to stop treating closeness as unpredictable. When unpredictability decreases, defensive responses naturally reduce. Eventually, a point is reached where emotional engagement no longer feels threatening. At that stage, behavior begins to reflect internal comfort rather than internal defense. This is where subtle changes become more visible, not because emotion has suddenly appeared, but because resistance to emotion has decreased. Understanding this framework removes many misunderstandings. It shows that emotional distance is not absence of feeling. It is a structured response to protect feeling. And when that structure begins to soften, what appears is not a sudden transformation, but a gradual return to emotional presence. As this pattern becomes clearer, the focus shifts toward recognizing the small behavioral signals that reveal when genuine emotional attachment is beginning to override protective instincts. When emotional attachment becomes stronger than internal resistance, behavior starts to shift in ways that are subtle but meaningful. These shifts are not dramatic changes in personality. They are quiet adjustments in attention, energy, and responsiveness that appear when emotional safety reaches a certain point. One of the first noticeable changes is stability and focus. Instead of alternating between engagement and emotional withdrawal, attention becomes more continuous. The mind is no longer scanning for reasons to disconnect or protect itself. This creates a sense of steadiness that is felt more than it is seen. It reflects a deeper internal decision that the moment does not require defense. Alongside this stability, there is a noticeable reduction in emotional filtering. Normally, thoughts and feelings pass through several internal checkpoints before being expressed in behavior. In this state, those checkpoints soften, reactions become more natural and less controlled. The effort to manage every emotional response decreases, allowing authenticity to appear in small but consistent ways. Another shift occurs in responsiveness. Instead of delayed or minimal reactions, there is a more immediate and aligned presence, not because of obligation, but because internal hesitation is no longer dominating the interaction. This creates smoother emotional exchange, where responses feel less calculated and more organic. A key element that emerges here is emotional continuity. Rather than treating each moment as separate and isolated, the mind begins to connect experiences over time. This creates a sense of familiarity and ease that reduces internal alertness. When emotional continuity builds, the need to reset boundaries repeatedly begins to fade. In this stage, there is also a noticeable difference in silence. Silence is no longer used as distance or avoidance. Instead, it becomes comfortable space. The absence of words does not create tension. It creates presence. This shift is important because it shows that silence is no longer functioning as protection, but as acceptance of emotional proximity. Another subtle change appears in physical awareness of presence. Attention becomes more anchored. Instead of being partially divided between internal processing and external engagement, more of the mental focus stays in the present interaction. This grounding effect is often a sign that emotional resistance is no longer dominating the internal state. There is also a shift in emotional pacing. Earlier patterns may involve quick emotional withdrawal after moments of closeness. In this stage, that withdrawal slows down. The transition between engagement and separation becomes less abrupt. Emotional transitions feel smoother, indicating reduced internal conflict. An important psychological aspect here is reduced anticipatory defense. The mind stops preparing in advance for emotional discomfort. This means less internal tension during interaction. When anticipation of discomfort decreases, presence becomes more relaxed. This relaxation is not forced. It happens naturally as the nervous system recalibrates its response to emotional safety. Another key indicator is consistency in small actions. Instead of emotional expression being limited to isolated moments, it begins to appear in repeated behaviors. This consistency is significant because it shows that emotional openness is no longer dependent on specific conditions. It is becoming part of a stable pattern rather than a temporary state. There is also a change in emotional recovery time. After moments of intensity or closeness, the return to emotional neutrality becomes slower. Instead of immediate distancing, there is a lingering sense of connection. This delay in withdrawal suggests that emotional engagement is holding longer than before. One of the most overlooked signs is reduction in internal resistance during shared presence. Previously, closeness might trigger subtle tension or the need to mentally step back. In this phase, that tension decreases. Presence feels less demanding and more natural, allowing emotional space to exist without triggering withdrawal responses. Another important shift is the presence of quiet attentiveness. This is not active expression, but steady observation paired with emotional involvement. Attention becomes more tuned in, not through effort, but through reduced internal distraction. This type of attentiveness often signals that emotional energy is being directed toward connection rather than self-protection. At this stage, emotional control is still present, but it is no longer rigid, it becomes flexible. Instead of controlling every reaction tightly, there is room for spontaneity. This flexibility indicates that emotional safety is strong enough to allow unpredictability without triggering defense mechanisms. There is also a noticeable change in emotional memory response. Past emotional experiences no longer dominate present interaction as strongly. The influence of old patterns weakens, allowing current experiences to feel more relevant than past associations. This shift is essential for deeper emotional engagement to continue developing. Another subtle but powerful sign is willingness to remain emotionally available without immediate retreat. Even when emotions become intense, there is less urgency to disconnect. Instead, there is a capacity to stay within the experience without needing to escape it quickly. This reflects growing tolerance for emotional depth. In addition, internal dialogue becomes less critical and more accepting. The mental evaluation of emotions softens. Instead of constantly analyzing what is being felt, there is more allowance for simply experiencing it. This reduction in self-monitoring creates more space for genuine emotional presence. All of these changes together form a pattern that is not loud or obvious, but deeply meaningful. They show that emotional attachment is no longer being blocked by protective mechanisms in the same way. Instead, it is beginning to integrate into behavior naturally, without force or pressure. As these signs accumulate, they point toward a deeper transformation in how emotional connection is experienced. The next step is understanding how these subtle patterns distinguish genuine emotional attachment from temporary attraction, and why most people often misread this difference completely. When emotional patterns are observed over time, one of the most important distinctions to understand is the difference between temporary attraction and deeper emotional attachment. On the surface, both can look similar. Both can involve attention, interest, and moments of closeness. But the internal structure behind each one is completely different. Temporary attraction is driven by surface-level stimulation. It is based on immediate interest, novelty, or physical response. It can feel strong in the beginning, but it does not require emotional depth to exist. Because of this, it often lacks consistency. It appears in bursts and fades when the stimulation decreases. Emotional attachment, on the other hand, develops through repeated emotional experiences that create familiarity and internal comfort. It is not dependent on intensity. It is dependent on stability. Over time, the mind begins to associate a specific presence with emotional grounding, which creates a deeper sense of connection that is less reactive and more steady. One of the clearest differences between these two states is behavioral persistence. Temporary attraction tends to fluctuate quickly. Interest may rise and fall depending on external factors. Emotional attachment shows more continuity, even when circumstances change. The connection remains present in subtle ways, even during periods of distance or silence. Another important distinction is emotional investment. In temporary attraction, emotional energy remains on the surface. There is interest but limited internal involvement. In emotional attachment, energy begins to move inward. Thoughts about the connection continue beyond direct interaction. The presence of the other person becomes part of internal reflection, not just external experience. There is also a difference in emotional priority. Temporary attraction competes with many other stimuli. It can be easily replaced or redirected. Emotional attachment creates a sense of emotional importance that does not easily shift. It becomes part of internal structure, influencing attention even when not actively engaged. Consistency of emotional response is another key indicator. In temporary attraction, reactions are often inconsistent. Emotional tone may change depending on mood or situation. In emotional attachment, responses become more stable. Even when external conditions vary, the underlying emotional tone remains connected. Another layer involves emotional memory integration. Temporary attraction does not deeply integrate experiences into long-term emotional memory. Once the moment passes, it loses significance quickly. Emotional attachment stores experiences in a more lasting way. Even small interactions carry meaning and are remembered in subtle emotional detail. Time also reveals differences clearly. Temporary attraction weakens when time and distance increase. Emotional attachment often strengthens or stabilizes with time, especially when emotional experiences have been consistent. The absence of constant interaction does not erase the connection. Instead, it allows reflection to deepen it internally. A critical psychological difference lies in emotional dependency patterns. Temporary attraction often relies on external presence to maintain interest. Without interaction, it fades. Emotional attachment develops internal continuity, where emotional connection can exist even in absence. This internalized bond is what makes it more enduring. Another important distinction is emotional response to separation. In temporary attraction, separation leads to quick detachment and minimal emotional impact. In emotional attachment, separation often creates reflection and awareness of emotional significance. The absence is felt in a more meaningful way, even if not openly expressed. Attention patterns also reveal the difference. Temporary attraction tends to be selective and situational. Attention is given when interest is stimulated. Emotional attachment shows more spontaneous attention, where thoughts and awareness naturally return without external triggers. There is also a difference in emotional tolerance. Temporary attraction has low tolerance for discomfort or emotional complexity. When situations become emotionally challenging, disengagement happens easily. Emotional attachment shows higher tolerance, allowing emotional complexity to exist without immediate withdrawal. Another subtle indicator is emotional integration into identity. Temporary attraction remains separate from self-perception. It is experienced as something external. Emotional attachment begins to integrate into internal identity structure. The connection becomes part of emotional reference points, influencing how situations are interpreted. Communication patterns also shift between the two states. Temporary attraction often focuses on surface-level interaction. Emotional attachment gradually moves toward deeper emotional awareness, even when communication remains simple. Meaning becomes embedded in tone, timing, and consistency rather than just words. Another important aspect is emotional adaptability. Temporary attraction is easily disrupted by external changes. Emotional attachment adapts to changes while maintaining underlying connection. It adjusts without collapsing, which shows a stronger internal foundation. Emotional response to vulnerability also differs significantly. In temporary attraction, vulnerability is often avoided or minimized. In emotional attachment, vulnerability becomes more acceptable over time, even if it is expressed indirectly. The emotional system becomes more open to deeper experience. There is also a difference in internal emotional recall. Temporary attraction does not generate frequent internal reflection. Emotional attachment creates spontaneous recall of shared moments, thoughts, and emotional impressions. This internal return to connection is a strong indicator of deeper bonding.